Okay, so I'm getting ready to take this truck for a test drive, and I'm going to show you what the steering does and explain how I've gone through and diagnosing the wandering steering issue that these Fords seem to have. Okay, so we're gonna drive this thing around and I'll show you what the steering is doing. This is a 2000 F250 4x4. It's got 238,000 on the clock. It runs perfect. I don't have any issues with the engine or any of that, but I'll show you what this steering is doing. The pump doesn't whine. There's nothing wrong with the power steering pump. And the truck drives just fine. But once you get to where you're trying to just keep it in between two lanes, it just seems like you gotta nudge the steering, and you'll see my hand. And so it's just got like a stiff spot right here. And any time that you have to turn the wheel, you gotta kind of nudge it a little bit, and then it never wants to self-center. It's basically what's going on. And it's really hard to drive with your knee, or if you're trying to drive one-handed, and especially if you're pulling a trailer. So I'll show you a few things that I've done. One of them was the adjustment nut on the top of the, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but they're usually real hard to see that, but there's an adjustment nut right on the top of that gearbox, and it's a lock nut with an Allen head in the top. A lot of people say to adjust that thing, and yeah, mine had a little tiny bit of play, but it wasn't bad, so I did adjust that. But some of the other stuff, the obvious things that you look for are, you know, steering links to see if there's any play. And I've gone in there and jiggled this wheel back and forth, and actually all of my steering links are really nice and tight. One other thing that the guys say to look for is these U-joints right here. If they don't ever get locked in and they just sit like this, then when you turn the wheel back and forth, it could be that it's nice and loose on that U-joint, but if you turn it 90 degrees, see, it's still easy to turn. So I've checked all of those. I've actually greased them when I first bought the truck. My ball joints are greased and they're not bound up. I've actually jacked the truck up, and I put it on jack stands so you can see. And I've gone in and I've turned the wheel back and forth without the engine running, and they're just easy, no drag whatsoever on the steering wheel. A lot of guys say that if these ball joints here and the upper ball joint, if they get tight and they don't have any grease in them, they'll get stiff, and when you go to turn the wheel back and forth, see, this wheel turns nice and easy. I mean, I'm just barely putting my leg on it to turn it, and they both turn nice and free, and you can see things moving. I don't have any noticeable play in anything. So again, the stiff spot on the steering, really, I'm convinced at this point that it's in that gearbox. Okay, so I'm back. I've just opened this up. I haven't pulled the lid off of it yet, but you can see it's packaged. It's actually pretty hard to get open. They've got a lot of staples in there. It's packaged really nice, but let's take a look at this thing. So here is what it looks like when it shows up, and there is the blue top gearbox. And they're real picky about making sure that you put these tags back on. I read the instructions when I bought it. There it is. So I'll get this thing set out, and I'll just take a quick look at it. Basically, I paid $310 off of their website, and they're going to give me a $150 core back on my old gearbox, and I've basically got 21 days to get this done and get it shipped back. I'm going to save all of this stuff, and I'll put my old one back in there, but basically here it is. It's just a gearbox, obviously, but it's supposed to be a good one. They make the red top one, which is about $415, and they make the blue top one, which is $310. And I've done a lot of reading on it, and a lot of guys said that the blue top one is just as good as what, you know, a lot of people claim. So, and it's got a warranty on it and all that kind of stuff. So if I have any issues with it, I'll definitely take it back. But one thing about it is you got to make sure you get the right one with the right splines, and they make a 32 spline and a 36 spline. But I did some reading on it, and the easiest way to tell this is there's a part number stamped right on the bottom of your Pitman arm that's coming off of the gearbox. And if you look at the Pitman arm, and I've gone in with my finger and just kind of wiped that, but you can see there's a part number stamped on there. It's a Y something or other. I think it's like Y035 dash something something something, and I'll put a link in here. But there was a link on the website that I found that showed all the part numbers, and it showed if you had this, there was like 6 or 8 of them that were 36 splines, and there were like 5 or 6 that were 32 spline. And I double checked that number right there, and sure enough, it said it was 36 spline. Okay, I'm back. Started taking out a few things. I pulled the air box out, and again, this is an aftermarket one, but it came out pretty easy. Just a few bolts, and it has the little sensor that was on the very back, and that was hard to get to because it was clear back up here against the brake master cylinder and all that, but I just had to make sure not damage that wire. Anyway, I got that out of the way. Just wanted to show progress. Pulled the battery out, and then I unhooked the negative on the other battery over there, just so we don't have any issues. I've got some little bit more work done on it, and I'll show you what I'm doing here. I got all that turbo inlet tube pulled out of the way. I've got it sitting right over here. It was really dirty, so I'm going to clean it up pretty good. But there's that one bolt right there, and that goes through the steering knuckle right into the gearbox, and I'm going to pull that bolt out. And then this shaft is a 2-piece shaft, and once I pull that bolt out of the way, that shaft will go in. And then here's the 2 power steering lines going onto the gearbox, and they're a 5/8, and I got a 5/8 tubing wrench on there, and I checked it. It looks like both of them are 5/8. So I'm getting ready to pull those loose, and then once I get those loose, then I'm going to come down. Actually, I'll probably knock this Pitman arm off first, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of power steering fluid leaking out of there. So I pulled the cotter pin out. That's a 13/16 castle nut right on the Pitman arm. And if you notice, right on this edge, there's a little raised area there, and I'm going to hit that with a big hammer several times probably. Sometimes you get lucky and you just wrap it one time and it'll pop right out. So this link, I've just got it wedged back there. It's a nice little spot to put it. But anyway, it was hooked onto the Pitman arm right there, and I had to rap on that quite a few times with a hammer, and it finally busted loose. And then I just took that arm, and it's just kind of wedged up in there to get it out of my way, because I'm getting ready to pull these lines. And I got my bucket down here to catch any stuff that spills out, and then I'll show you what I got going on up here now. So I pulled that one bolt out, and it's just this one bolt. It comes right out of that steering knuckle, and this shaft just pulled right off of there. See, it just moves right out of the way. And then these again are 5/8, and I use a tubing wrench to break them loose. And I'm going to pull these lines off with a regular 5/8 wrench. I got them broke loose, and then I'm just going to use a regular 5/8, get those broke loose or taken loose, and then I'm going to set them in that little pan, and hopefully I won't make a big mess everywhere. And then once I get the box out of the way, then I'll be able to move them lines and get a full-size pan underneath them or whatever. I got those two lines, got the two power steering lines pulled off of the gearbox. They both have O-rings on them, so you want to make sure and replace the O-rings. Hopefully I can get them at AutoZone or whatever, O'Reilly's or whatever. Anyway, I got that little drip pan in there. There's nothing else holding it in except these 3 bolts out here on the outside. And I pulled my tire off just so I could get a little better view at everything. But these are 9/16 socket, and I'm gonna impact those 3 bolts. 1, 2, 3. And before, I'll probably pull this one and this one, and I'll loosen that one and leave that one in, and then I'll probably crawl underneath and hold on to the gearbox, and then I'll hand thread that one out, and then gearbox should just come on out after that. Okay, so that came right out. Again, I just pulled out them 3 bolts right there, and there they are. I did want to point out on here that there is a flat spot on the bottom of this spline, the input shaft of the gearbox. So when I go back in, I'll make darn sure that everything is pointing forward on the new box, and that them splines, this flat spot is on the bottom. Okay, so we're back. I went out this morning and went to O'Reilly's to see if they had a Pitman arm puller, because I'm getting ready to take the Pitman arm off of the old one and put it on the new one. And I went and picked this thing up, and they say it's ever tough, and my guess is it's never tough. It's just a cheap looking thing, and so I tried to fit it, and it will not fit on there. So my dad was a mechanic for over 50 years, and he passed away about 10 years ago, so I inherited a lot of his tools. And I went scrounging around in one of his old toolboxes, and lo and behold, I found an actual Pitman arm puller, and it fits. So I lubed up the I just put a little WD-40 on the threads just now, just to see if it was going to work. So I'm getting ready to pop this big nut off of there, and it ended up, and also my dad's old bucket of big sockets, and I found an inch and a 15, or yeah, inch and 5/16, sorry, and it's a Mac, so it's a good one. Anyway, and that seems to fit really nice. The other thing that I did was I took the fancy little caps out of the new one, and I threaded it into my old one just temporarily so I don't make a huge mess, even though it did drain all night long. But we'll try this real quick and see if I get lucky. Sorry about the compressor. I figured it would kick on, but what do you know, I got lucky. It popped right on off. I was getting a little scared there for a second, but The old man's tools held up, and I'll guarantee you he probably bought that thing 40, 50 years ago. Alright, so that all went pretty smooth. I just put that Pitman arm back on, and it only goes on, it can go on 4 different directions, but I knew it was pointing forward. I put the little caps back in, so when I'm starting to put this back in, I don't want a lot of dirt to get in there. And again, I said I'm using this cheaper stuff from Walmart. I'm getting ready to do the flushing before I install this, and I'll show you what I got going on over here. So my little drip pan that I had put in last night, I had that little drip pan down there, that little gray thing, but it tipped sideways and it ended up getting a mess underneath my truck. But so now what I'm doing is I've got a clear plastic jug on the high side, on the high pressure side, and on the low return line I just got another jug. It's just sitting in here, and I'm gonna add transmission fluid to the pump here before I get started. And I pulled out my dust covers for the intake and the turbo, because when I crank it over I don't want them to get sucked in there. And I got a battery charger going because I'm going to be doing a little bit of cranking. Believe it or not, this is what the Blue Top recommends. And then over here, what I've got going on is I pulled off the little solenoid wire right here. I just pulled that little booger off, and it went right on there. And then I've got this little jumper, and right now it's just sitting there. It's not hooked to anything yet, but if I touch it, you'll see it'll crank over. Okay, so what I'm doing, and I've already done a little bit, you can see some of the fluid has already gone into this clear jug, I filled up the reservoir, and I try to make sure that that doesn't drop down below the actual pump area. But I'll crank this over and you'll see what it'll be squirting in there. All right. So I got my son here helping me now. It's because it took too many hands, but you can see that the fluid that's going into the jug, it really is bright red already. So I would say that that thing is pretty well flushed, but I'm going to go ahead and do what's the last bit that's left in there. Okay, so I'm going to do the last little bit here, and I got my son in the truck, and when he starts pumping that brake, he pumps it as I'm cranking it, and it really squirts the fluid. Okay, so I'm getting ready to put the Blue Top steering gear back in. I've got the Pitman arm on. I just ran the nut down and I used the impact gun to sock it down pretty good. But they call for 170 to 230 foot-pounds. So I'm going to wait until I get it on the truck, and then I'm going to torque it with a torque wrench. But anyway, so I'm getting ready to put it in. I got my little helper here. This is my little granddaughter, Tinley, and she's helping me. Say hi, Tinley. Anyway, so I've cleaned these bolts up with a wire brush, and they're not bad. All right, so I'm gonna set these here, and I'm gonna attempt to put that gearbox back in there. Oh, just get one bolt started. The bolt goes back in there. It comes out. It came out fairly easy. Go back in. It looks like it's one bolt. bottom line there. I got it started. So, the key is, don't put that one into the floor. There, I stepped too far back. No problem. No, this is one. And we're not working anything like that. All right. Well, that went in pretty easy, I guess. The key is to just tilt it. Don't tilt it so far back when you get ready to go in with it. But okay, so we're back. I've been fighting O-ring issues, trying to determine what exact O-ring am I supposed to use on the two power steering lines that I pulled off of the gearbox. The ones in the center are the ones that came off of the gearbox. The ones on the right are the SAE standard 1/4 and 5/16, and the ones on the left are the 6mm and the 8mm, and these are the 079 thickness, and these are the 062 thickness. And the ones in the middle, it's hard to measure them, but I've used some calipers and I've done quite a bit of checking on this, and the ones in the center come closer to me to the 079. They're a little thicker than the 062, so and they're worn out. You can see that these things are worn out, and that's why I want to replace them. Hopefully that's focused on there. So I'm going with the two that are marked with blue. Those are the two that I'm going with. That's the standard one, that's the original one, and that's the metric one. So anyway, long story short, yesterday I had put the metric ones on, and that's what you see right here. So apparently the metric ones were too big. I decided to pull off the lines and check them, and I'm glad I did, because you can see that it's all deformed, and on the bigger one it actually took a chunk of it off. So it's obvious that they are not the metric ones. So I'm going to go back in with the standard ones. So that's a 1/4 and a 5/16, and that's what these are right there. There's the 1/4 and the 5/16. So in the middle of all this, I decided I was going to replace one of my pressure lines, because this one was old in the original line. So I went out and I bought another line. I tried to get one from the dealer, but of course they didn't have it in stock, and I want to get this back together, so I bought one from O'Reilly's. It's got a slightly different looking connector where it goes onto the gearbox, but it's the right thread, it's the right diameter, and I'm going to put it came with an O-ring, and the O-ring, it's kind of interesting. The O-ring that came with it is even slightly different. It's just a little bit, it's real close to that one, but it looks to me like it's just a tiny bit thicker. But I think it's because the fitting on that one, that's not an OEM hose, but this is the O-ring that came with it. That's the one I'm going to use. Anyway, I just wanted to share with you what I found, and make sure that you don't use the metric O-rings, because they are not right. And I'm going to put these on, and I'm going to check it, pull it back off, and just see what the O-ring looks like, just to be sure. Okay, so I've got everything pretty well put back together. I haven't put the steering shaft on yet. All I got left to do is just put that steering shaft on the splined nub sticking out there on the gearbox. Again, I went ahead and replaced this power steering line just because the old one is laying right there, and I figured if I'm already in here this deep, I might as well change it. And so right now what I'm doing is I've filled up the reservoir, and I've got my little power wire that I hooked up the other day, and I extended it a little bit, but it basically just goes right over to the solenoid, and I showed that earlier. And I just got it kind of rigged over here for now. And then what I'm doing is I'm just cranking it over. I've got the key turned off, so there's no way it's going to start. I just wanted to show you how the reservoir will pump down as I crank it over. And then you don't want it to get below the, there, look at all them bubbles coming up. And I'll add a little more. And they say that these starters, you can actually crank them for about 20 seconds, which I think is a little extreme, so I'm only doing a few seconds at a time. Plus I'm watching that reservoir, and I'm also checking for leaks down at that steering gear just to make sure nothing's leaking. And up here where I put that new line on, up here, it's right there. So I'm kind of looking at all this as I crank it over. See, and it just drinks it down. Much more bubbles coming up. Right now it's basically filling up the gearbox and all of the fluid that I had drained out of it, out of the lines and everything else, and it's basically just filling everything up. And I don't see any leaks over here. And I've got the battery charger on it too, just to kind of help that go a little bit. I do kind of notice it's a little bit wet right there, but I don't know if that was from my wrench earlier. I'll keep an eye on that and see. But anyway, here we go again. Just trying to make sure I don't suck in a bunch of air is what I'm trying to do. Just add a little and as I go. But anyway, that's the gist of it. I'll check back in here in just a second and see. Okay, so it's really loud. You're probably gonna have a hard time hearing me, but I went ahead and put my air filter on just temporarily, just so I could start it up. And I've been watching that reservoir and I've been adding fluid to it. And I never had any bubbles. Everything seemed to be working just fine. And I've been coming in here and pressing that brake multiple times. And you can hear the engine kind of bog a little bit when you do that. But I'd say we're about ready to put this sucker back together, and I'll take it for a spin. I'll come back as soon as I get it all back together and drive it. Okay, so we're on the downhill run here. I finished up, as I said earlier, I put the new hoses on. I had fired up the truck temporarily. I had the air cleaner sitting on there backwards. I checked for leaks. I ran the steering wheel back and forth 3 or 4 times, lock to lock while it was running. Pumped the brakes several times, topped off the fluid. No air bubbles, it wasn't milky, everything looked really good. I'm pretty pleased with everything so far. No leaks. I checked the hoses real good. I checked the fitting up there. So now I've just got done stabbing the intake or turbo tube, and that was fun because it has to go in behind this thing. And this pressure or low return line for the power steering pump. Anyway, I just fished it. I just kind of had to fish it in there, and I cleaned it up best I could. I'm getting ready to put these on, and I know these things have to be torqued a certain torque, and I haven't looked it up yet, but I'm gonna look up the torque on those, because they say if you over tighten them you can have problems. So I've got a little inch-pound torque wrench. I'll probably snug them down. This one's loose. I'll just snug them down, and then I'll figure out what the torque is on them. Anyway, once I get this in, then I just gotta, I'm probably gonna go ahead and, well, I have to. I gotta pull this battery back out so I can get my air box back in. But once I get the air box in, get this tightened down, get the air box put back in, and get the battery put back in, and then put the wheel on, and I'll be ready to take it for a test drive. So, and I'll video that once I get ready. Alright, the beast is back together. I just fired it up, let it run for a little bit just to make sure nothing was leaking. I'm going to take it for the first drive here. So it looks like the steering wheel is just a little bit off. So I know how to fix that. Alright, we'll see how it does once I get up to speed. I mean, it feels pretty solid. It doesn't feel like it has that dead spot anymore, but it's kind of hard to tell. Definitely feels better. So far so good. I just need to straighten up that steering a little bit.